So if you are listening to this podcast the day it drops, it's February 23rd, which means tomorrow is the Maven conference in Southern California, February 24th, 25th. If you're listening to this later, darn it, you missed the conference. But hopefully...
You are not a loser. We still love you.
Oh my gosh, don't
But
call
God
names.
forgives you.
So if you are listening to this before the conference, and you can come to Southern California, but most likely you can't make travel arrangements in a day, but you can go to mavenconferences.com and still get on to sign up for the live stream of the conference. So do that. But today we are going to play a recording from last year's pre-conference event. Last week we played part one of this, and this week we're playing part two.
Yeah, the new normal. The consequences of rethinking the family. And in this week's clip, what we are going to do is play a talk by Katy Faust, who is the president of Them Before Us. And she's also the author of a book entitled Them Before Us, which is a really good book. And her organization is doing incredible work. And she talks about some of the real challenges to the family. And then we're also going to include in this week's podcast the audio from the panel Q&A where John Stonestreet, Katy Faust, myself, Erin, and John's wife, Sarah, all discuss these issues and kind of knock it around and answer questions and deal with the challenges that face our families today.
Well, that was great. I'm so inspired. I just wanted to lean back and be like, yes. And when he said, why did Adam need Eve? Why? And I was like, because Adam could not find the sour cream on his own in the refrigerator, right? He needed a woman to be like, honey, back shelf. Well, that's what happens at my house. That's the suitable helping that goes on at our place. I'm really excited to be here. Partially because I could use a few more puzzle pieces in my worldview. I tend to be a bit of a reactionary, and I see something that frustrates me or makes me mad or a question that needs to be answered, and then I put all my energy towards it. And so I could really use a little more of a systematic explanation for some of these questions. So I'm really looking forward to soaking in what all of these speakers have to say. Case in point, in terms of being a little bit distracted by things that come up in my life. Yesterday, I was on a plane home from Michigan, and I really like my plane time because it's the only time in my life where I'm only doing one thing. All the rest of my life, I'm always doing two things at once. I'm running while I'm responding to emails, right? Or I'm doing soccer carpool while I'm listening to a podcast, for research purposes, right? Or I'm doing the dishes and I'm helping my kid with their homework. So the only time that I ever only do one thing is when I'm on an airplane and there's no pets and there's no kids and there's no other distractions. So I save all of my intense writing projects for the airplane. But yesterday, I got on the plane and I saw this announcement from Dave Rubin. And I like Dave Rubin, right? He has kind of become a darling of the right. He was formerly on the left. He's a gay man, very vocal about his marriage to his partner Dave, Dave and Dave. And I've followed him for a long time. And I know that they had been trying to have a child through surrogacy. In fact, they had made previous attempts that had failed. So like most children created through reproductive technologies, a lot of children are lost in the process before you actually get to a live birth. So yesterday, I sat down on the plane and I saw this announcement of these dual children that they had created. Now, it didn't totally surprise me because Dave isn't a Christian. He's not even a conservative. He just wants the government to get out of his life. But what did surprise me is Prager University congratulating him, and the Blaze TV congratulating him, and Christopher Rufo, who's doing incredible work to expose critical race theory and corrupt sex ed materials in our schools, congratulating him, and Megyn Kelly congratulating him, Candace Owens congratulating him, right? And all of these different prominent conservatives cheering him on. The other response that I saw was revulsion, right? A lot of people going, well, this is sick and twisted. And even some Christians going, he's an abomination, right? This is wickedness. This is child abuse. And then I saw a few people going, I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have my mom growing up, right? But the majority of them didn't quite understand exactly what was going on and what the problem was. Not even a lot of the Christians that responded, right? So I'll tell you some of my responses to that, because I spent the entire 4 hours of that flight tweeting. And normally I don't tweet a lot, but it was a tweet fest yesterday, because all of these conservative organizations, right, the places where we're getting most of our news from, in terms of like conservatives and Christians, they didn't get this right, because hardly anybody is getting this right. So how do we have a right response to a guy who's a nice guy, who seems to be in a relationship with another nice guy, both of whom would probably be good dads? How do we respond to their pregnancy announcement, right? Well, I think a lot of pro-lifers, in fact, I saw pro-lifers going, Alicia Krause, I think, Daily Wire, yay, babies, right? Well, yeah, we love babies. But that's not what surrogacy is. Surrogacy is on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide. That's what surrogacy is. And yet very few conservatives seem to have that kind of clarity on the topic. You had, people like Dennis Prager, who has produced videos on the 10 Commandments, right? And the goodness of the 10 Commandments, congratulating Dave Rubin on creating 2 intentionally motherless children. How does that intersect with the 10 Commandments that he supposedly loves? Well, the 5th commandment, the 1st commandment with the promise, is honor your mother and father so you can live long in the land. But that congratulations is actually endorsing a situation where those children will never be able to obey that commandment, right? So they don't even have that right. Even Dave Rubin himself, who came over to our side of the aisle because he supposedly loves liberty and God-given rights. Maybe he understands, maybe he doesn't, but no other conservative seems to be calling out the fact that these babies are losing 3 of their fundamental rights. The first one is their right to life. Only 93% of babies created through IVF, right, which these 2 babies are, 93% of those babies will not be born alive. In reproductive technologies, unborn babies, embryos, are treated like designer disposable products. Only 7% of them will make it through the gauntlet to get to the point where they can be implanted. And then, if they're one of the lucky few that doesn't miscarry or experience incredible preterm birth or all of the other very high risk factors that go along with surrogacy, 7% of them will be alive. And I hope that that's the case for these 2 children that are now currently being commissioned by Dave and his partner. So first of all, surrogacy, this arrangement that he set up, violates children's right to life. Second, it violates children's fundamental right to be known and loved by the 2 people responsible for their existence, their mother and their father. And tomorrow, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that. What are children's rights? What is this specific right to their own mother and father? What does that have to do with the marriage and family discussion? How does it implicate all of these different questions that we have around marriage and family? But these children, right, their right to their mother is being violated. In fact, surrogacy violates the rights that children have to 3 mothers. That's what surrogacy does. Surrogacy splices what should be 1 woman, mother, into 3 purchasable and optional women in a child's life. The genetic mother, which I was just listening to Dave Rubin's explanation about this, you can purchase from a catalog. Right now, grab your phone, you can look up egg donor catalog, and you can look at catalogs of mothers for your future child. And he described it as, it's kind of like a dating app, right? You figure out, well, this one's pretty, well, this one has the degree, well, she lives close to me. I seem to like her better. And that's exactly what it is, right? You're shopping for your child's genetic mother. Second, you have to rent the womb of another woman, the birth mother, right? This is the most expensive part of the process. It's very easy to get sperm. In fact, Dave acknowledged that they had more than enough sperm to make this process happen. But they had no eggs, so they had to purchase 18 from a woman that he said was very young and healthy, because young women have lots of eggs, but they don't. Women all have a fixed number of eggs through their life. So what he's saying is, I'm going to take 18 months of your future fertility and extract them and purchase them from you right now so that I can have them. Women don't have limitless eggs. We have a finite number of eggs. And they made a transaction to purchase several of those eggs from this woman. He acknowledged that the two babies, who were both sired by the different guys, both had the same biological mother, because they said, well, we thought that was important. We thought it was important that they would have the same biological mom. Why? Why do you think that's important? Do you think that that's going to matter to the kids, to have the same mom? You're probably right, it will. And they said they both wanted to be the biological father of one of the children. Why? Why does that matter to you? Seems like it mattered enough for you to create two different sets of embryos so that each of you could have a genetic connection. And that's often how this goes. Reproductive technologies are the adults going, well, this is what is going to make me happy. This is what's going to fulfill me, right? But nobody looks at it from the other side of the perspective. Well, you want a genetic connection to your child because there's something special about that, but you expect the kid to be okay never having a genetic connection with their mother? And the third way that these children's rights are being violated is they are being bought and sold. Children have a right to be born free. But reproductive technologies, especially surrogacy and third-party reproduction, violates that right. 50% of children who were created through sperm donation said that they were burdened and bothered by the fact that money changed hands during their conception. They feel like a product. Why? Because they are a product. And yet, even though these fundamental rights, the right to life, the right to a mother and father, the right to be born free and not bought and sold, fundamental, God-given, really self-evident rights, for some reason, nobody brought any of that up. It was either total congratulations or expressions of revulsion. So that's a problem, because neither of these responses serve the child. They don't, right? This validation of adult desire that costs children these three fundamental rights, that doesn't help the kid. And this expression of revulsion, it simply serves to say, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for the adults that you're having that response, right? It further reinforces this idea that the adults are the victims in this scenario, but they're not. Children are the victims. So we're going to spend some time tomorrow talking about the state of the family. We are going to go through, I'm going to go through kind of all the different ways that children's rights are being violated in our society today when it comes to marriage and family. But I'll give you a summary here. The state of the family in America, 2022, is the expectations that kids sacrifice for adults. In pretty much every area of marriage and family, whether it's just our conception of marriage, the definition of marriage, whether it is our laws around divorce, whether it's the promotion of same-sex parenting and very, very soon polygamy, right? We already have one city in Massachusetts, Somerville, that legalized polygamous relationships in 2020, because John's exactly right. Like, all the same arguments that you can use to legalize same-sex marriage absolutely work for polygamy. So that's on the horizon. Third-party reproduction, sperm donation, egg donation, surrogacy, cohabitation. transgender parents, all of it. What is the state of the family there? It is expecting the child to sacrifice so the adults can live as they please. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that tomorrow. And we're also going to talk about that tomorrow from the perspective of natural law. So I'm a Christian. My pastor husband, I keep him around for the eye candy factor. He's in the back. He came with me today. We love Scripture. I carry my Bible around with me everywhere. I am like a card-carrying Bible thumper. But if we are going to be effective, we are going to make this case about marriage and family to our unbelieving friends in the realm of public policy and largely on social media, not from the perspective of God made marriage, but you will harm kids if you don't defend this definition of marriage. So we're going to spend some time talking about that tomorrow. But in summary, I'll tell you that what is the state of the family today? It is one where kids sacrifice so adults can live as they please. And for Christians, that is a big problem. Because if you guys are familiar with your Bibles, you've probably read through the Old Testament, and you've seen that there tends to be 4 demographics that God sets apart for specific care and protection. And they are the poor, the alien, the widow, and the fatherless, right? There's something about those 4 demographics that deserve special attention and protection, that actually have a disproportionate number of laws in terms of making sure that they are not victimized, that they're cared for, that special provisions are made for them. And so we know, if you're biblical, we understand that we have an obligation to protect the fatherless, right? In fact, James tells us that pure and undefiled religion before God is to care for orphans and widows in their distress. We have a mandate. Like, if we are not doing this thing, we actually have to question, do we really know Jesus? Do we really know Jesus if we are not caring for the most vulnerable? And yet, what I see is this tendency among Christians, and sometimes even entire denominations, that are compromising on the question of marriage and sexuality, right? They are bending God's truth on the topic of marriage. So that's a problem, because the way that kids were protected in the Old Testament, and we're going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow too, is God was very, very careful to set up biological laws and also moral laws to ensure that children did not become fatherless. First, except by tragedy. First, he required a man and woman to be involved in the baby-making process, right? So no kid could come into this world unless there was a father involved. Second, he set up moral laws to insist that baby-making would only happen within the context of a lifelong commitment between that man and woman. So God did everything that he could to ensure that kids were not fatherless. Sin entered the world, of course, and some kids lost their father and mother to tragedy. That is not the main reason why kids are fatherless and motherless today. Today, kids are fatherless and motherless because adult desires are being prioritized above their rights. And churches that compromise on the topic of marriage and family are aiding and abetting that process. So Christians need to get this right. I understand, I promise I understand how uncomfortable it is to stand firmly on God's desire for, God's command for proper sexual relationships and marriage. I understand that because I've lived it, it'll get you kicked out of Facebook mom groups. It'll heighten tensions within your family. You'll lose friends over it. But the alternative is kids are going to suffer because you don't have the courage to speak up. If we don't get this right, if the nations disciple the church instead of the church discipling the nations, really what you're saying is, It's okay that kids are being victimized. I need the social approval. I actually think that Christians who are standing on a biblical perspective, through a biblical lens, looking at this through a biblical lens, are really the last hope that kids have for two main reasons. Number one, we actually have the worldview that supports the importance of mother, father, and marriage. And we're going to hear a lot more about that this weekend. A lot of different worldview puzzle pieces being put together in our life. But the second reason why I think Christians are really one of the only hopes that kids have is we get our approval from something outside of the world. And that's not really something that anybody else can say, right? I was just cracked my Bible open before I came up here. It opened to Isaiah. There was 2 or 3 different places that just dropped off the page to me and said, fear not, fear not. Why? Because when you fear God properly, you don't have to fear anything else. But if you don't have God to fear, you will fear everything else. And so what I have found is the few people that were willing to stand up and say, hey, Dave Rubin, I like you. You're probably going to be a great dad. This is absolutely wrong. Kids need a mother. The very few that were willing to do that were people that had a little cross in their Bible, right? The ones that were willing to say, I follow Jesus, right? Maybe they didn't have all the arguments down exactly right, but they weren't going to bend. So that's it, right? God will give us the courage. But what I hope you come away with after this weekend is the content, to be able to stand up and fight well on behalf of the most vulnerable, because if we don't, and if we follow the world into compromise, we are not defending the fatherless, we are endorsing fatherlessness. And that is something that, we will grieve the heart of God. We will grieve the heart of God if we don't get this right. So now I think we are going to have the ladies come up and do some Q&A.
Thank you, Katy.
Thanks, Katy.
And
come on up, guys.
Gentlemen. So we are going to take some of the questions that have been coming in. John, I'm going to hit this one to you first. And thank you, all of you, for the talks. It gets me excited about the weekend. I hope it gets you guys excited too. Okay, so John, you say that a malleable family structure is problematic, but what God considered family seems to be malleable as well. Here's the example. In the genealogy of Jesus, there are some people who seem to not be family in the way you present. How do you understand the larger family of God, and is there any rigidity there?
Nowhere in the Bible is family presented as being different than what the created norm is. When it is presented, and there's something else that's being presented, it's being reported on, because in a fallen context, the family doesn't always look like God's created intent. It doesn't mean that the intent or the created goodness has changed. This is one of the things I think is so critical in the point that Katy was making with Dave Rubin. Adoption is one of the most wonderful things that there can possibly be, because you're taking someone who was subjected to some sort of harm and you're providing another chance, you're providing another context for them to experience love and care and that sort of thing. That's a very different sort of act than actually going through some form of artificial reproductive technology to create the problem that now needs to be solved. In other words, the created goodness, the created structure, the created design of how procreation is to happen, that doesn't change because there are things have gone wrong. And it doesn't justify intentionally breaking that norm and breaking that structure. I'm trying to think through the genealogies and think exactly about what maybe this questioner is referring to without specifics. I mean, obviously there's 2 different genealogies, and one of the genealogies too, we have 4 women that are mentioned, all of whom are women of have sexual reputation problems, right? From Rahab to Ruth to Mary, there's somebody else. Who's that? Bathsheba. Yeah, Bathsheba. Yeah, that's right. Because God is working in the midst of a fallen world to bring the Messiah through family structures that were broken, doesn't mean that there is an endorsement of the broken family structures, or that we should then somehow treat marriage as if it's actually not a thing. I'll say one last thing. The chaos that comes throughout the biblical narrative when the norm of marriage is violated. So, for example, polygamy is reported on throughout the Old Testament. Anytime that it's reported on, it's a disaster. Like, bad things happen, you know. I don't think anybody here would pray to be a patriarch's wife. Like, it didn't go well. There are, and these are the consequences too of trying to stretch or break the design and make it into something else. It doesn't work. So the Bible reports on all these things, but it never endorses any other family structure than what is the created norm. And I'll go back to the last thing, which is when Jesus was asked how to actually think about marriage and how to think about changing marriage in a particular direction, even from the Jewish law, he goes back to that created design. And his conclusion was different than the interpretation of the Jewish law that the teachers of the law had come up with, which is there's a whole lot of room for divorce. He grants that, okay, divorce happens because of the hardness of your heart, but what God has put together, let no man separate. So again, whose design is this? It's God. Who made the decision that these people come together and that there's a permanence to it? It's God. It's built into the fabric of the universe like gravity. So the Bible reports on a lot of things, but I can't think of anywhere that it endorses any sort of alternative family structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is where, you know, in the Christian worldview, and we often kind of look at the biblical story, the biblical worldview in 4 chapters, right? You have creation in Genesis 1, but not only do you have Genesis 1, then you have Genesis 3. You have the fall. And then kind of as our second chapter, the third chapter is redemption, the fourth chapter is restoration. And so I think taking this and the biblical story makes sense of this. It makes sense of the idea that Genesis 1, there is a design, an objectively good design for family. One man, one woman, becoming one for one lifetime. That's the design. Of course, Genesis 3 comes around, and we have a fall that explains and makes sense of what we see all around us. We see all this brokenness. And to admit the brokenness isn't somehow to devalue an adoption, but it is to admit and to acknowledge the nature of reality, that that's not the original design. Now, and this is where then you get into chapter 3. Well, that's not the end of the story, right? The fall. No, then you've got this beautiful chapter 3 of redemption. And God is, he's redeeming all of this brokenness. He's reconciling, of course, broken men and women back to himself. And all of us are in that part of the story right now. And I mean, I just think about, your story and my story, Erin, right? And, Erin's story of being a single mom. And to admit that that's not God's original intention isn't to devalue you or our daughter Lexi or anything like that, but it is to recognize the nature of reality. And if you don't recognize that, because it almost seems like we don't want to, in an effort to preserve people's feelings and not get them, upset, we won't say these kinds of things. But we need to, because it actually will help us to acknowledge that, this isn't God's original intention, so there's going to be some unique challenges that we're going to face as a family that another family might not face. And what Genesis 3 tells us, that even when you do follow God's original design, hey, there's still brokenness in that situation too, as we can all attest to.
Not in my family. I don't know what's happening.
I've been around your family, and I can attest to the huge amounts of brokenness.
To the brokenness.
Okay, this next question goes off of that, and we'll start with you, Katy. Why do Christians, this is from Maggie, so thanks, Maggie. Why do you think Christians have been so open to IVF, in vitro fertilization, and surrogacy? And then she goes on to say, how can the church better address and talk about this and to deter Christians from embracing it without making those who were created through these means feel marginalized?
Yeah, so good. I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that we love babies, right? Like, why is it that there's some moral confusion about IVF and donor conception and surrogacy? It's because we love babies. Like, do you love babies? Raise your hand. I love babies, right? And we have been fighting for children. You guys may not necessarily think a lot about or understand children's right to their mother and father. My guess is all of you understand that children have a right to life because you've been fighting for it for a long time, right? Probably longer than I've been on this culture war path. And so when we think about that, we think anything that leads to babies must be good, right? And so we do need, what became very, very clear to me yesterday, even watching conservatives congratulate these two men who were creating surrogate-born babies, is we need an education, right? All of us need to better understand this. And honestly, don't want to sound hyperbolic, but this just might be the greatest battle of our time, right? We are right back. This is back to the Civil War era of buying and selling people, swapping and trading. And we need to get this right now because artificial wombs are on the horizon. And I've even seen pro-lifers say, oh, wonderful, artificial wombs. That means that if somebody doesn't want their baby, we can just put them in an artificial womb so that they won't abort them. No. Artificial wombs means you get to cut out the most expensive part of the baby-making conveyor belt of sperm, egg, womb. And what artificial wombs means is mass-produced factories of babies. Okay, so we have to get this right now, while we're only dealing with IVF, donor conception, and surrogacy. And here's the good news. When I talk to people about this, when they understand the cost to children, when they see that it harms their right to life, when they hear the stories of children who were intentionally and commercially separated from their mother or father at birth, when we talk about the importance of the maternal bond and the continuation of that to a child's, the importance of that to their future health of trust and attachment, and why we should never intentionally inflict that loss on a child because adult desires are overriding those children's rights. Christians get it. The thing is, we're just not talking about it. When we do, when they understand, when they can hear the stories, when they can look at the studies, and then when they see, oh my gosh, this totally lines up with God's virtuous commands for sex and marriage, they're with us. They're with us. The problem is we're just not giving it very little to no attention. Thankfully, there are some organizations that are talking about it. Colson Center is one of them. So if you're not listening to their podcasts, subscribe. But there's not enough, right? There's not enough. These major conservative organizations obviously don't get it. So I'm not surprised that a lot of Christians are lost as well.
Yeah. If I could add to that, when the Obergefell decision came down from the Supreme Court, this happened at the tail end of a dramatic marriage movement in the church. If you go back to Focus on the Family, you go back to marriage seminars, and we were at an all-time high in talking about how to do marriage in the years leading up to the Supreme Court fundamentally in law changing the definition of marriage. So what happened? What happened was all of these seminars and all of this emphasis on marriage had to do with, here's how you do marriage. What was happening at the same time is in our culture, the definition of what marriage is and what marriage is for was fundamentally being changed in dramatic ways. And same-sex marriage wasn't the first one to do that. No-fault divorce turned marriage into an institution not about children's rights, but about adult happiness. And what we said, that was the first version of that myth that we now repeat over and over at each new stage of the sexual revolution, which is, oh, the kids will be fine. Like, we'll change this and the kids will be fine. We'll change that and the kids will be fine. So what's missing in how we're talking about marriage and how we're talking about childbearing and life is what this stuff is for. We talk about ethics as if it's just about here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And the culture has fundamentally changed our understanding of what those things are. Think about what happens when you go in for premarital counseling, if some of you remember this. What tends to happen in premarital counseling, I'm talking about at your church with your pastor, it tends to be something like, now, do you guys agree on whether you're supposed to have kids or whether you want kids or not? What have you just done? You've taken kids and asked the entire question about the future of your marriage in terms of adult happiness. What premarital counseling even fundamentally asks the question, what are kids for? What's marriage for? What's the relationship between those things? And oh, by the way, you're going to face ethical challenges like in vitro fertilization and surrogacy. Are you clear on what this stuff is? The church has not talked about this, and it's also not talked about the purpose. Now, a great way to see this is if you can compare what's happening in the evangelical church when what's happened with Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics have had a robust theological set of work done on sexuality and marriage with Pope John Paul's Theology of the Body. So there is this rich resource there where they have actually really wrestled and gone back to the creation story and what God intended. What's missing was translating that to the average everyday Catholic in the pew. So, but there at least was that theology. I think what, by and large, and I'm stereotyping here a little bit, but with evangelicals, what we've done is we talk about right and wrong and ethics and that sort of stuff. But when it comes to sex and marriage and procreation, we haven't done that hard theological work to really wrestle with what is marriage for? What are children for? What is procreation for? So that we can actually ground the ethical things. And when you don't start there, then every new issue becomes kind of like a brand new piece of the puzzle that we got to fit into the big puzzle. And we haven't done the edges as churches. That's what I'm trying to say. We haven't done the edges, particularly when it comes to the human body and what it means to be made in God's image, male and female. And so it's like we're playing cultural whack-a-mole, and we can't keep up. Like, you know, a new artificial reproductive technology pops up every 3 days, you know? And then it's like, it goes from experimental to available, and the journey from experimental to available takes a long time. The journey from available to normal, that takes no time at all. And we're just not ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Can I give everyone some homework? Just along, you know, kind of piggybacking off what John and Katy have said here. Go to your church this Sunday, okay? Go to your church this Sunday and do your own survey and ask the question, these two questions that John has asked. Just ask the adults and ask the youth, what is marriage and what is it for? And just keep track of the answers that you get. And I think you'll be surprised when you get answers that don't appeal to the personal satisfaction of adults or personal desire, kind of the satisfaction of my own personal desires. If you hear anyone talk about it differently in that, then ask them some questions where they get their view from. But mostly you're going to hear appeals to our own personal desires. And I think what that should help tell us, because that's going to be the majority of the answers, and what that should help tell us is that we're in a lot more trouble than we think. I think we're in a lot worse shape than we actually realize in the church in America.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my assumption is that a lot of our listeners are going, oh, I have not thought about it from this framework before, which also leads to the next assumption that a lot of our listeners may have gone through with in vitro fertilization or supported this way of thinking about adult happiness. How do we encourage the next step, like towards repentance, or what do we tell our listeners who are kind of like,
Well, I think with some of these things, we need to, number one, help Christians think clearly, think worldviewishly about these things, and then recognize that there are some good, healthy debates amongst Christians. And so, you know, with like something like in vitro, right? You do have Christians on different sides of this issue. And there are particular, and so one of the questions might be, what are the particular aspects of in vitro that are problematic? Why is it problematic? And because we wouldn't say that in principle, medical or some kind of scientific or medical assistance in something like that would be wrong in and of itself. So what we need to do is think more carefully about these things, number one. And help Christians to begin to reason properly, starting with our biblical worldview. So if you have a medical technology that somehow harms the integrity of a family, somehow separates children from their parents, then that's going to be a principle that's going to help us weigh these kinds of things. And so, and that's where we need to be careful thinkers. This is where we need to make careful distinctions. Because would we say that in all cases, let's say for something like sperm donation, in all cases is sperm donation out of bounds for the Christian? Well, there's different kinds of sperm donation. There's a situation where you have a husband, and a wife. And so there's not actually a separation of the biology there in that situation. Would we rule that out? Or is it in the situations when you're bringing in a third party? And so this is just some things I think that illustrate we need to think well. And unfortunately, I think that the church, let's just admit that the church is so anti-intellectual in the U.S. And we have mistaken notions of faith that actually harm our thinking about the faith. And therefore, we don't produce in our churches thoughtful answers to these most difficult questions. And when you look at kind of experts in different fields, where are all the kind of the evangelical Christians, right? There's not a whole lot out there because we haven't fostered that. And so we really need kind of a evangelical cultural revolution, even within our own churches, I think, to be equipped to navigate this stuff.
What I would say to that question is I've certainly had topics that I've learned about it, and I'm like, wait a second, this isn't the right thing, and had to repent. One of them was when I was on birth control, my husband actually was taking an ethics class, finally, a chance to think well, and he came home and he said, Katy, I'm learning about all these different forms of birth control, and I don't think you should be on anything. And he kind of talked through, that was the first time I'd even thought about hormonal birth control, which is crazy because I was 24. And that was our first encounter with something we had never thought of before. And I think that we made some mistakes. And I know we made some mistakes in our thought process and in our methodology when it came to our approach to children. And so we stopped and we repented. And then we moved forward with the new information that we had. So welcome to the Christian life. I think we've all been there in terms of, and you know what? This is new. This is something that is kind of breaking into the world in new ways. And so it is being forced in front of you for the first time. So if this is your first encounter with it, welcome. And with your biblical worldview and with the courage that I know God is going to give you, the reality is whatever you've struggled with in the past or dealt with in the past, the most incredible thing about this Christian life is all of the things that are our biggest struggles, our biggest suffering, our greatest weaknesses, our greatest failures, right? Those are the things that Satan tries to decapitate us with, right? He will cripple us with those things. But the incredible thing is if we take those and we put it at the foot of the cross, God gives it back to us in the form of a weapon that the darkness cannot overcome. So whatever it is that you've gone through personally, maybe you haven't made the right decision, maybe you have suffered uniquely in some of these ways, don't let it debilitate you. Hand it to God. Let him give it back to you in the form of something that will fight for everything that he loves and the most precious, the most vulnerable. I know that God will use that in some way to defend the most vulnerable.
Okay, so we do need to wrap up, but on that note of further thinking and learning, I do want to, for the people in the audience, we have 2 really good resources. And if you're listening on the live stream, look these up. But John and Brett's book, A Practical Guide to Culture.
Or is it Brett and John's?
Or maybe it's Brett and John's book. It depends who you talk to, really. And then we also have Katy's book, Them Before Us. And she gave you a taste of these topics that really we need to think through as Christians. And her book is a wonderful resource on these topics. But before we end it and let you guys go, all 3 of you are leading ministries, nonprofits that are making an impact in culture. So if people have never heard of your nonprofit before, your ministry, just a quick explanation of what you're doing and how they can go to you and find more resources. So Katy, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think that what we're doing at Them Before Us, well, the name is Them Before Us, them the children, before us the adults. Because right now in culture, we are doing us before them, right? It's the adults who get what they want, when they want it, the way they want it, and kids will just deal with whatever is left over, okay? So we flip that. We say, no, children have a right to their mother and father. Adult desire needs to conform to that right. And so that right makes demands of all adults, single, married, gay, and straight. It addresses every marriage and family issue, from the definition of parenthood to whether or not gay couples can adopt, and what is adoption, and what is adoption for, and who is adoption for, to all of these things we've talked about tonight, reproductive technologies, why marriage is a social justice issue for children, proper understanding of divorce. So the bottom line is, like, we will trigger you somehow. Like, that's just it. Like, every topic that we have is something that could get you canceled if you were to bring that up in your classroom or boardroom. But we want to make you experts on it. That's one reason we wrote the book, is we distilled all of the best studies on all these different topics so that you know more than anyone else. But also, one thing that our nonprofit does is we catalog the stories of children who grew up in modern families, so you could understand how that loss impacted them in a physical, emotional, academic, and relational sense, often throughout their entire life. So we want to show you the kids that should be the object of your courage, right? For whom you should speak up. So that's what we're doing. And one of the best ways to get involved, I think, is read the book and become an expert, because there really is nobody else that's going to do this for you. It's really just ordinary people who are willing to understand and do what PragerU is not doing, and what Blaze TV is not doing, and what some of our biggest conservative pundits are doing. It's really just going to be you that's able to do it.
Where online can they find you?
ThemBeforeUs.com.
Okay. Maven. Erin and I started Maven about, a little over 4 years ago now. So we still feel like we're this toddler kind of walking around, but and sometimes we fall down. But our mission, the word Maven refers to someone who's knowledgeable in a certain field and then seeks to pass that on to others. And that's what we want to do for the sake of the next generation. We are passionate about the next generation, discipling our kids and our teens to really know what they believe, why they believe it, and why it matters. And that really, for us, communicates the whole Christian worldview. It's not only knowing how the Christian worldview accounts for every aspect of reality, but then it's living it out. Ideas have consequences. And because we are passionate about the next generation, we are also passionate about those who are discipling the next generation. So parents, grandparents, youth workers, pastors, educators, homeschoolers. We need more allies in this battle, in particular because of where the culture's at. We just need to be allies in the church. And so we're trying to equip those individuals to help disciple their kids well. And that's why we started the Maven conference 4 years ago, was to go after that group and help equip that group. And you can find us at Maven Truth. MavenTruth.com would be the place to start.
I'm the president of an organization called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. It was one of the organizations founded by the late Chuck Colson, if that name rings a bell. But really, our mission is twofold. We want to help Christians make sense of the most challenging issues of the moment from the solid ground of the big story of Scripture. And that requires two things. Number one is you got to know what's happening in the culture. And number two, you got to know what those eternal, the eternal unchanging story of Scripture is, so that you have that bigger context in which you can make sense of what's happening in the world. So the two examples of that we do a daily commentary called Breakpoint. It's a 4-minute commentary on something happening in the culture, and you can get it through podcasts, you can get it through email, you can hear it on the radio, and then on the complete other side of the spectrum, we have a 1-year deep dive program in Christian worldview called Colson Fellows, and that is about as deep as you can go without going into seminary in the big, beautiful story of Scripture and how that provides the framework for a truly Christian worldview. So you can find us, probably the best place to go to get started is breakpoint.org, or you can look up the Breakpoint podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay, and Sarah, you do a podcast.
Yeah, with
a lovely
you.
gal.
I know, such a lovely
Okay, so
gal.
tell us you can share with everybody about our podcast in case they haven't.
Oh, yeah,
heard.
okay. Yeah, because we were going to tell you guys about it at the beginning, and then we got all flustered, so... We were going to say a lot of things at the beginning. It was going to be great, but sorry. Anyway, so the Colson Center, which John is the president of, we're part of their podcast network, and it's called the Strong Women Podcast. And Erin and I both have daughters, and we were looking at the messages coming at us and at our daughters for what it means to be a strong woman, and we were like, oh gosh, how do we tell our girls, how do we paint a different picture for our girls? Because, on one side you've got culture saying to be a strong woman is to pursue your own happiness, no matter what the consequences and who the casualties are, like we've been talking about tonight. And that's not strong. I mean, that's actually the weakest choice, because it's easy to walk away from the hard things. Unfortunately, the consequences do follow later, but the immediate thing is easy. But we wanted to say, Erin and I have so many wise, strong women in our life. And I was talking with my daughters about, the difference between the strong message that's coming out of culture, pursue your own happiness, versus the older lady who is with her husband every week at church, wheeling him into church. That is strong. That's what we want to cast the vision for. Or the woman who has an autistic child, and that is a daily struggle. But she is there. She's staying in that hard situation or whatever. And what we found is that it looks different in different situations and different vocations and seasons of life, but there's some common threads, and one of the biggest common threads obviously is walking faithfully with Christ. And we have been in a mentoring session for now a year and a half with all these different wise ladies. Katy has been on, and guess what? She's going to be on. We're going to do a live podcast tomorrow from the Maven conference during registration, right? And so you can come hear us talk with Katy some more and ask her some fun questions. But did I cover it all? What am I missing?
Good job. You did well. Thanks. Okay, so this weekend we are talking about how we live in this world, but not of this world. And tonight was a great way to kick that off. So thank you for joining us. Those of you here, thank you for joining us on the live stream. And we will see you all tomorrow night as we kick off the Maven conference.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.